Good afternoon, folks. I am going to teach you how to make a sword today. SCA rattan type sword. You'll have to go to some other channel to learn how to forge one out of steel. Swords are an incredibly personalized thing. There are probably 1,000 different ways to make these. Everyone's going to have their preference on length, weight, feel, hilt type. I get all that. What I'm talking about is basic construction, especially for you folks that are new, you've never built a sword before, or maybe you're a mid-level fighter and you think, man, if I could just have a little bit better stick, that would up my game. It might actually. I've definitely picked up people's swords that felt like 2x4s, right? They just felt like clubs. And in my opinion, they shouldn't feel like that. They should be light in the hand. If you've ever handled a real steel sword, you'll know they don't feel like 2x4s. They feel very lively. They're very easy to handle. And there's no reason that our swords shouldn't feel somewhat like that. Obviously, we're dealing with a completely different material that behaves differently. But my goal has always been, I want this to feel like my steel sword does. And I've made a couple of these. I've made one or two swords over my almost 30-year career. So I'm going to teach you how I do it. If you do it a different way, totally fine. I hope you can pick up some tips and tricks from this, and I'm just going to walk you through the whole process. I'm starting with an old sword. This one's beat up, it's broken down. At this point, it's definitely time to retire it. In fact, we've been using this sword for speed drill demos. This reflective tape is for the radar gun to pick up. We were curious what the tip speed of a SCA rattan sword is. It's pretty fast, actually. You'd be surprised. So I'm going to take this sword apart and we're going to start from there. All I really want from this is the basket. I often also reuse the triggers if they're in good shape. Why not? It's already cut and good to go. As I go through this, I'm going to talk about tools that you use to do this and a bunch of different ways. I know that not everybody has a shaving horse and a draw knife and a full cabinet shop at their disposal. I get that. When I started, I had to walk down to the local Ace Hardware and beg them to use the bench in the back of their shop so I could do some of this stuff. Like I had nothing. So I get that, and I'm going to try to make sure that I include different methods of work if you don't happen to have all the fancy tools, or if you have barely anything at all. I'll make that accessible as well. I'm going to start with the easiest method, which is using a draw knife and a shaving horse, but I will also show alternate methods of construction. Okay, so, again, starting from step one. When I attach these basket hilts, this is a Balder style. This is an incredibly common style of basket hilt. You see these everywhere. It's kind of the generic SCA basket hilt. Steel basket hilts are slightly different. I'm not going to cover that because I don't use them. But one of the advantages of these plastic ones is that I don't use any sort of metal in the attachments. This is just strapping tape covered with whatever finishing tape I'm using. Makes taking it apart much easier. And I've never had one of these come loose. I know some people use a metal hose clamp around here. I don't see the need for it. I've never had one come loose. And again, I've been doing this quite a while. So I'm just going to cut on either side. Here's a quick tip. I said I was going to do a bunch of tips and tricks. When you're using a carpet knife, utility knife, razor knife, whatever you want to call this, keep your grasping hand above where you're cutting, right? My hand is up here, the knife is down here, I'm cutting this direction. When I slip, which I will, I'm not going to cut myself. If I was holding it like this and cutting this direction, there's a really good chance of burying this blade in your hand. Ask me how I know. I have unfortunately cut myself many times in my career as a cabinet maker. So that's just a general purpose, no matter what you're cutting, whether it's packaging or anything else. Don't draw the knife towards your grasping hand. Find a way to get your grasping hand, your control hand, above the knife so that when you cut, you're not cutting into your fingers. All right, so now the hilt is loose. And it's gonna fight me coming off. Come on, there we go. Now, I like consistency in my weapons. So I tend to keep whatever sword I'm replacing. That's my template for the new weapon. And if I had anything about this weapon that I especially liked, the grip profile, the length, the thickness, the rigidity, that kind of thing, I will try to copy that onto the next piece. The thing about rattan being a natural material is that there's a lot of variation, and we'll go over that a little bit later. But this is my template for my next stick. If you do not have a sword as a template, you're starting with just a bare piece of rattan, that's fine. That's going to be your template for your next stick. Nothing I'm going to talk about here requires you to have a stick. This trigger, I do use triggers inside my gauntlets or inside my basket hilt. This one's not worth saving, so I'm not going to cut it off. Sometimes if I'm desperate, I'll use whatever I have available, and this is not good trigger material. This is a thin piece of veg tan. It's fine, but I'm not going to save that. So this is now just a template. I'm going to take the old basket. I'm going to pull off any residual tape. I found that writing your name on the inside of your basket makes it last a lot longer than if you try to write it in marker on your sword. Obviously, swords get retaped, they get beat up, and the inside of your basket is a better place to have your name. Having your name on your weapons doesn't guarantee they're going to come back to you, but if it's just a sword and it has no name on it whatsoever, it's never going to come back to you. So it's worth it to go ahead and write your name in here. I also will date the basket hilt. This is just a curiosity of mine. So I've been reusing this same basket hilt since 2012. So it's seen some use. I do check them out. I'm looking for cracks. If they are going to break, they tend to break up here. This is the newer reinforced model that has these kind of outward lips here. And while I have broken these, this one seems like it's in pretty good shape. I don't see any cracks. I don't see any separation. It doesn't feel weak and spongy. I can't easily compress it. So while this is quite old, it seems fine to me. All right, we're going to set that aside and pull out a piece of rattan. If you are brand new to fighting, if you've never seen rattan before, this is rattan. It looks like bamboo because of these nodules, but it's actually solid. I don't know if I can get the camera to focus on that. It's a vine. It grows in the Asiatic Pacific region. There's a bunch of different places that we source rattan from, primarily used in furniture making and the SCA, where we use a whole lot of this stuff. Just do a brief discussion on rattan selection. If you're buying rattan at an event, it usually comes in staves that are 8 or 9 feet long. Sometimes you can get longer staves than that. Selecting rattan is its own art form, and there's a lot of personal preference involved in it. When you pick up the stave, it's kind of hard to imagine what it's going to feel like when it's in 36-inch sections for a sword. You've got this big 8-foot section, and I don't know if I can describe what I'm looking for in a stick. I want a certain diameter, obviously. I don't want super thick, because then I just have to end up shaving it down. Obviously, too thin is no good either. So what is this? This is a pretty ideal stick for me. 1.5 inches. So yeah, 1.5 inches is a pretty good starting point for the swords that I make. I will end up shaving down the sides, creating an oval profile, but that way I have just about the right amount of depth of the weapon. So 1.5 inches for me. Some people want to get as close to 1/4 inch as they can, 1.25 inches, I mean. The danger with that is, of course, that any side shaping, or if it dives in a little bit, you then have to try and pad that out to make sure that it equals the 1.25 inches. We'll talk about the construction on that. Yeah, again, it is hard to describe what makes a good stick of rattan. I want it to be fairly stiff. I want it to have a certain weight. When it starts getting really light, to me that means that it's either very porous, it's kind of hollow, it's got big pores in the middle of each ring. Those can be good if you're looking for a very, very, very light weapon. I tend towards the denser sticks. I think they last a lot longer, and to me they feel better in the hand. But yeah, if you go up to a vendor and they've got 40 sticks of rattan, feel them, you know. go through as much as you can and get a feel on it and see about what it feels like. If you're just starting out, I definitely recommend experimenting a little bit. Get a stick that feels pretty heavy, get a stick that feels pretty light. You're going to go through a lot of rattan in your fighting career. I have no idea, probably made a couple hundred if I've made one. I really wish I'd kept track, but I've made hundreds of swords over my career. So what you like, is going to be up to you, what feels good. So yeah, individual preference is a lot of it. Sometimes you get what you get. Sometimes you're out of rattan and you just get the best stick you can. And it's going to be some swords that are mid-quality. Again, it's fine. You're going to go through a lot of swords. I don't know how many swords I make in a year. Quite a few. It depends on how active I'm being, how frequently I'm fighting, etc. But you're going to go through several swords in a fighting year. If you're fighting at least once a month and going to a tourney every now and then, you're going to go through sticks. And that's just part of the game. These don't last forever. They're designed to break, essentially. That's what makes them safer than, say, using an oaken stave that when it snaps, you didn't have 3 feet of sharp oak sticking out. We settled on rattan a very long time ago because when it does break, it turns into a broom, which is moderately harmless. So, as I was saying, the reason we use rattan is that when it does break down, instead of having splinters, you get a broom, right? You get this broomed out. You can see that. These aren't quite as dangerous as they look. They're fairly soft. But obviously this stick is dead. I probably should have replaced this stick long before I finally replaced it. But yeah, this is why we use rattan, is that when it breaks, it turns into a broom. So, last thing on stick selection, I don't cut the new blank to the exact length of the old blank. I always go a couple inches long. So I like my swords to end up about 36, 37 inches long. But the way that I end up adjusting the final balance is by lengthening and shortening it. Because I almost always take it down to 1.25 inches on the sides. So there's not a lot of room for me to play there. So if I'm done, when I have the sword in hand, if it feels heavy, I'll just start taking 0.5 inches off the end until it feels right. And sometimes I end up with a stick that's significantly shorter than what I'm used to, my full 37-inch sword. But I'd rather have that than a stick that feels really heavy in the hand. So yeah, when you're starting with a new blank, I don't cut it exactly to the length of the old one. So the blanks that I keep for swords are always just a little bit longer. This one, remember there's a thrusting tip here. So this is about 2 inches longer than my finished sword will probably end up being. That's my preference. You do you. Another couple things on rattan selection. And when you're getting this is skin on rattan, meaning that it still has that hard bamboo-like outer skin. And it'll still have the knuckles on it, these ridges that grow every, 11 inches or so. It really depends on the species. Unfortunately, I don't have any raw rattan that I haven't already shaved down. But the first step when you're preparing your rattan is always going to be to knock these knuckles off. So I'll show you a little bit on this one. You can see a little bit left. Before you shave these, sometimes they can be pretty gnarly and they'll have pieces coming up from the sides. You want that as smooth as possible without cutting into the skin of the rattan too much on the parts you want to maintain. You can also buy turned rattan. It'll be exactly 1.25 inches and it'll have all the skin taken off, so it'll just be the rattan fibers. I don't personally like those shaved sticks. They're fine. I know a lot of people like them because they don't want to go through the steps of shaving it and doing everything else. I like having a rectangular or an oval cross section on my swords, and I like having the hard outer skin, especially on the striking surfaces. I think it makes the sword last a lot longer. But again, that's personal preference. We will be starting from skin on rattan, and I'll try to show you a bit of knuckle removal here. So I am fortunate enough to have a shaving horse, which I think is the easiest way to work with rattan. It's kind of ideal for working with rattan. If you don't have a shaving horse like this, I will show at the end of the video alternate methods of holding rattan to work on it. Also, a draw knife is ideal for working on rattan. There are other ways you could do this. You could use a rasp. I'm trying to think of how I would do it if I didn't have a draw knife. Probably a rasp. I suppose you could sand it, but you'd be sanding for a very long time. One nice thing about these draw knives is that they're not a very sought after antique tool, which means they're not worth a lot. You can pick these up for $1 or 50 cents or free. If you go on Facebook Marketplace or something like that and search for draw knife, you might find an antique draw knife for 10 bucks. And as long as it has a little bit of blade left, and this is not a good example because I've used this draw knife for a very long time, and I've personally worn it down even more than it was worn when I got it, and it was pretty worn out when I got it. But as long as it has a little bit of blade left, I'd go for at least 3/4 of an inch beyond the spine, if you can find that. You can pick these up super cheap. You can also buy them new. Rattan is very, very abrasive. It will dull your cutting edges very quickly. There's a lot of mineral content in this. And you'll find that it'll dull a cutting edge very fast. So I have, a draw knife and a plane that I use just on rattan because it'll ruin an edge normally. And I have stuff that I don't care if it gets ruined. If you can't find a draw knife, I have this old one. Again, I probably got this for free at the bottom of a box of old tools. Somebody made this out of an old file, right? It does not take a lot. They took a file, heated the ends, and ground an edge on it. This works fine. So there are ways of getting past not having a draw knife, but I highly recommend picking one up. Again, it's not a very sought after tool like an old plane or something, or an old saw that people want to hang on the wall. This is trash to most people, and you can get them very cheaply. So the first thing I'll do on the entire stave is knock the knuckles off. And that's just a matter of taking short little cuts right at each knuckle, rotating all the way around. And you just want it to be fairly smooth. You don't want to have any big chunks of knuckle sticking up. And that goes whether you're making a staff weapon like a poleaxe or a sword. You don't want those big knuckles underneath the tape. You want to get that fairly smooth. So yeah, this one is all fairly smooth already, but that would be the first step. Go through, knock those knuckles off, all up and down the stick. Remember that when you get to the end of your stick, you can also push a draw knife. You don't have to pull it. So if I get up here towards the end and I don't have anything I can hold on to, I'll just reverse the knife and I'll push instead of pull. So now you end up with your blank. It's got the skin on it all the way around. What I will do, and this is one of those very subjective things. Rattan is not a consistent thing. One end will be heavier than the other. And I'll flip it back and forth a few times and just play with it a bit and see which end feels better in the round. For this one, it feels like this is the heavy end. Yeah. So for me, I want the heavy end in my palm. I want the heavy end down here and I want the light end up here. If you can't tell the difference, then it doesn't matter. I do not think it matters one way or the other, whether you're working with the growth rings going this way or the growth rings going this way as far as durability. But feel-wise, it tends to be the heavy end is at the base of the vine. So in nature, the vine would have grown this direction. So this would have been the root, this would have been the end, and the rings are going this direction. That tends to be the way I like to make my sword, but that's not a hard and fast rule. I'm certain I've made them flipped around. It's just a matter of what feels good in the hand. Once I've decided on my handle end, I'm going to look at the stick. If the stick has a pronounced curve to it, and this one is pretty straight, but if the stick has a curve, I tend to start the sword as a scimitar shape, because as you are striking your opponent, rattan tends to bend towards the strike. So if you start with it tipped downwards, by the end of the sword's life, it's going to be a U facing the wrong direction. So if it has a bend to it, I want that bend to come upwards like it was a scimitar. So I'll look at the stick, I'll get an idea about how I want to hold it, and that feels good. Once I've done that, I'll take a marker and I'll make a mark along the vertical axis. You see that? So that is in line with my knuckles on the stick. This is important for my later sword making process. I want that to be the same on both ends. So now I have my center line marked on both sides. That's really important for me, and I'll show you why. Another way, if you have a hard time transferring that mark from one end to the other, is once you have your in line with your knuckles mark, lay that on the bench so that it is horizontal, and then you can come down and mark the other side. So there's a couple of additional layout marks that I'm going to put on the weapon. I'm going to take the basket hilt and lay it on the sword, and I'm going to mark, there we go. I'm going to mark right at the base there, and I'm going to mark at the top of the basket hilt. That defines where my handle is, and you'll see as I'm shaping this that that's the most important part of my shaping process. I'm just going to carry that all the way around. This does not have to be precise. This just gives me a guide when I start shaping the weapon. Now that I have my center line, I like to lay the blade so that the center line, the knuckle line, is horizontal. And I just do a quick dashed line down the top. Again, you'll see why this makes laying out the weapon a little bit easier later. And I absolutely know that there are people who, they want a stick and they want it quick. They're going to go through 10 sticks in the next few months. They do not worry about any of this stuff. They grab a stick. Sometimes they don't even shave it. They throw some tape on it and they go fight. And that is perfectly valid. Some of those guys are probably much better fighters than I'll ever be. This is my way of doing it. This is how I like to do it. So I have my dashed line that indicates the flat of the blade. And that'll come in handy when I'm in the shaving horse trying to make everything symmetrical. So that's our basic layout. That shows where the handle is. It shows where the pommel swell. It shows where the top is. And again, this is purely a personal preference thing. I make another mark about 6 inches above the top of the basket. Again, I'll show you why I do this when I'm back at the shaving horse. There is one more step on layout that I didn't show up there. Our weapons are supposed to be 1.25 inches minimum diameter. So when they take the marshalling gauge and run it up and down your weapon, if it's less than 1.25 inches, they're going to send you away because the weapon cannot be any thinner than 1.25 inches. I try to make sure that my finished piece of rattan is exactly 1.25 inches. I don't want any thinner, I don't want any thicker. I'd rather err on the side of caution and go a little bit thicker, even though I know that the tape and everything else that goes on top of it is going to push it over that limit. It's nice not to have to worry about it. And, you know, again, there's a safety margin there, 1 inch bar grill, 1.25 inch sword. It should never be able to go through. So yeah, make your stuff safe. Make sure that you're taking care of your opponents as well. I take a protractor. If you don't have a protractor, you can make a little go, no-go gauge, cut 1.25 inch slot in a piece of wood or metal so that you have a reliable 1.25 inch gauge. I lay it on top, centered, and I draw a couple parallel lines. I won't be using those until the very end of the process, and they're not necessary. You can do this without that step. This just gives me a quick visual reference as to what I'm looking for at the end. At the end of this process, what I want is a pronounced oval, and I'm going to draw it on here. What I want my finished stick to look like is something like this. Hopefully that shows up on the camera. That's the finished profile I want out of a stick. And I'll show you how I get that. So I always start with the handle. That's where most of the work goes into the weapon. This is where those dashed and dotted lines come in handy, because without those references, you're just looking at a bare stick of rattan and you're constantly trying to figure out which are the flats, which is the edge angle, all that stuff. Since I have these layout marks, which takes a minute to put on, I know exactly where I'm cutting. I know exactly what angles to plane, etc. I'm going to start with the handle. The handle is where I spend most of my time shaping, because I like a certain type of handle profile. Again, I know there's guys that leave it just like this. I've looked inside basket hilts and seen just raw rattan, and that's fine. That works for them. I have nothing to say about that. If it works, it works. I like a very specifically shaped handle, so I'm going to show you how I shape mine. The important thing on this shaping is that I leave this section down at the very end that interacts with the basket hilt, I leave it full round. It makes it a bit of a pain in the ass because you have to shave away from that, but I find that having a little bit of weight there, we're talking fractions of an ounce, but it's still a little bit. And these fractions of an ounce add up. I like having the full structure there on top and bottom. That gives a really nice, round, strong surface for the basket hilt to mount to. I think this is especially important if you're using a steel basket hilt. You want to leave this round, and you want to leave it round here. So the alternative would be shaving the entire stick, just taking shavings off the top and bottom, and having yourself an oval stick all the way up and down. It would work fine. Since I'm doing it by hand, it doesn't take me much longer to shape it this way. So I'm going to take my shave. I'm going to turn the stick so that if it had a blade, the blade would be horizontal. And working fairly slowly, because it's very easy to take off too much rattan at a go, especially with a draw knife. It's much easier to take off a little bit more than to go way too deep, and now you've kind of screwed up an entire stick. It's fixable, but why fix it? So I'm diving into the rattan. I'm taking off, I don't know, a fat 1/16 maybe, straight down. And then I'm stopping before I get to this final knuckle here. I'm going to go a little bit off horizontal, probably, I don't know, 20 degrees. This is just the rough profiling of the handle. And because I've done this, hundreds of times, I know exactly how much I want to take off. I know exactly the final shape I want to end up with. So I feel, perfectly comfortable doing all this without any test fitting. But again, I'm stopping all these cuts about halfway through, because I'm going to turn this around and I'm going to come the other direction. While it is absolutely possible, as I mentioned earlier, to push a draw knife, and you can do it this way, because this is a fairly precise cut, and because I have my horse set up so that I can work on either side of the head, I like to do it this way, where I put the work in the other side of the jaw, and then I come at it from the other direction. It's just a little bit more controlled for me. Same thing, come in this direction. And I'm just working until I meet those initial cuts. You know, again, as I was saying, since I know what profile I want, I'm doing almost all of the shaping right now. There will be some final fit up when I'm done, but it doesn't take much. Flipping around, just take a little bit more off this side. I'm taking a scooping cut so I don't dive in and have to go back the other direction. I don't want any strings, I don't want any splinters sticking up. I will be wrapping this handle. I know some people like the feel of raw rattan, that's fine. I like a wrapped handle. So right now what I have, and I have no idea if you'll be able to see, but I have just kind of a shallow dish, right? I'm just establishing the shape of the handle. It dives in, it goes flat, it comes back up. That's the basic handle shape. We're going to flip it over and do the exact same thing on the other side. Again, having these witness marks makes that very easy to set up. We'll see how much faster I can do this without trying to explain it as I go. Et voila. So I've established that shape, basic handle shape. See if my shirt can give you an idea of the shape of that. So right now it's symmetrical. I know there's definitely people that like a round handle, that's fine. I like to have at least some handle flats so I can feel the edge. In addition to that, and this is definitely one of those me-specific things, I like having a teardrop shape. I like having the front edge of the blade slightly narrower than the back edge of the blade. So I'm going to establish that while I'm at the shaving horse already. So I'm going to check to make sure which direction I want as front. On this sword, this is the front edge. So all I'm going to do is fairly carefully, I'm going to start paring away a little bit more material on that front edge. I know some fighters that like to have a very sharp edge that fits into their knuckle creases so they can really feel the edge of the blade. I like something in between. I still want mine fairly rounded because I spend a lot of time with a sword in my hand and it gets uncomfortable. But I like to have a definite edge that I can feel in my glove. Yeah, that feels about right. I'm going to run my thumb over the rest of the blade. What I'm feeling for are any hard ridges, any hot spots, any places that I know will wear a blister in your hand, like that one that I've got recently. And I'll just gently take those off. And it's just a matter of just barely drawing the knife along that hard corner until that hard corner is soft. And I'll check all the way around to make sure that there's not a lot of that. I'll take off a little bit more here. Yeah, as I said early in the video, this is super individualistic. You know, what feels good to you may feel like a club to me and vice versa. So I encourage you to experiment with different handle shapes. At practice, you know, ask your friends if you can hold their swords and take a couple passes with them. Maybe somebody's fighting with a stick that you like and you want to give it a try before you make your own stick. I know I would be happy to lend somebody one of my sticks so they could feel what it's like. And as I said earlier as well, I know some very experienced, very good fighters that do not put time and attention into making their sticks. You know, it's about as bare bones as you can get. Rattan with some duct tape on it and go. And that's fine. This will not make you a better fighter. Let me put that out there. A bad sword can hold you back a little bit. It can make fighting harder. It can make you slower. It can make you less precise. But just having a good stick is not going to make you a great fighter. If only it were that easy. You know, if you put me in a Formula One car, I'm not going to be a better driver. There we go. Since I will be taping these, I'm not worried about getting this satin smooth. I just don't want any hard ridges. So since I started that hard edge, I call it a hard edge. It's just a tapering. So you can see on this side, we're still fairly thick on the edge of the rattan. And on the edge side, we're getting narrower. I just want to match that bevel on the other side of the stick. And I'm not as crazy as some people. I know people that carve kind of hand grip shapes into theirs with like finger grooves and stuff. Do what you do, man. If you like the way that makes your sticks feel, awesome. Also, let me apologize for my very gender-specific language. When I say dudes and man and all that stuff, I mean all of y'all. I hope this will be very gender neutral. Everybody fights. Folks. Y'all folks. All y'alls. I'm an old dude, and it's hard for me to change, but I do actually care, and I want to be inclusive. There. So, and I'll see if this works. So this is the handle shape that I'm going for. That front leading edge being fairly sharp, it sits right inside those knuckles. And when I grip the weapon, when I grip the sword, when I grip the stick, the baton, I can feel the edge perfectly in my fingers. blindfolded, I know exactly where that edge is. I like that. This already feels 50% better. Having an actual shaped handle, even though the rest of this is still a log, it now feels much more like a sword to me. Now we're going to shape the rest of it. So we talked earlier about there's a lot of personal preference in here. At this point, you can shave all the way down if you want. The reason that I made this top scallop is I was mentioning earlier, I like having the basket hilt attachments resting on a complete round of rattan. This is especially important if you're using a metal basket hilt, but I think it helps with these plastic basket hilts as well. And what I do personally is I leave about 6 inches above the top of the basket hilt full round. This helps concentrate more of the weight towards the handle end of the weapon, which again makes it feel more like a real sword and not just a stick. You know, it's never going to feel like a 12th century longsword, but it helps a little bit. I am also a sword blocker, and I tend to catch a lot of my shots right here. So having a full thickness of rattan helps preserve the life of this weapon. If when I get this sword finished out, if it still feels really heavy, I might take that off. But again, those sides don't weigh a lot. They don't weigh enough to make a huge difference in the weight of the weapon, which is why I do most of my balancing by taking off the end. That seems to make a much bigger difference in the way the sword feels than taking an 1/8 of an inch off the side. It's just not a lot of weight there. I should bring my little drug dealer's scale out here and see how much these shavings weigh. But, we're talking about this stuff, and this is not heavy. It's really not. I'm gonna put the stick in the shave horse handle in here. I have my little ring 6 inches above the basket, which is where I start. And I have my witness line telling me that this is the flat of the blade. Same thing as the handle. So I'm going to start at that taper, and I'm going to take, I don't know, about a 1/2 inch wide shaving all the way down, as much as I can. Instead of repositioning it every time, I'm going to take another shaving and then reposition. So I'm using 1.5 inch rattan. I've done this 100 times. I know about how much to take off before I start getting too thin. Be careful here, because it's very easy to go too deep and now you have a thin spot in the middle of your sword. You don't want that. So if you're unsure, take off a little bit on each side, check the measurement, take off a little bit more. But again, I can pretty much do this blindfolded. And I know that at this point, with this flat being about 3/4 of an inch wide, I'm getting pretty close to the final dimension. I still have a ways to go, but this is a good starting point. I'm going to flip it over and do the exact same thing on the other side. I'm critically short of rattan. Otherwise, I'd kind of show you what goes wrong when you dig too deeply. Rattan is just a bundle of continuous fibers. So if you start digging in too deeply here, you can get way too thin by the time you get down to the end. So this is the part of the process there's a little finesse here. You don't want to dig too deep on the flat. But if your rattan is a consistent diameter, and this stuff is pretty consistent, a consistent flat on each side will take off a consistent amount, right? It's pretty close anyway. We're not making parts for the space shuttle. The next time I make a stick, and I should have thought to do it this time, I'm actually going to weigh the sword before I touch it. And then I'm going to weigh it after each step and see how much weight each part of this process removes from the sword. I am kind of curious about that. Since I make all my swords the same way, you know, they're going to end up about the same weight. But I am curious how much weight I just took off the sides. So at this point, I have two flats. Right, we've now reached kind of an flat-sided oval shape. And you can see by those pieces I drew at the end, I'm still a good 1/8 of an inch off my final dimension, and I'm fine with that. You can use the Drawknife to go all the way down, but what I see most often is somewhere in the middle here, you'll start to get thin. So take your gauge and make sure you're not getting too thin. So while at the tip, I still have an 1/8 of an inch, right here in the center, I am maybe a 1/16 of an inch off of 1 1/4. So another shaving on either side would go too far. And then it gets a little thicker here, yada, yada, yada. And I do want this to be very consistent, and I'll show you how I get that. Before I go to that step, I'm gonna start making that oval shape that I talked about. But yeah, so do be careful taking the sides down because you can go too thin. And right here, I am right at 1 1/4. So I don't want to take any more material off this section. But because this is a circle, this is 1 1/4, this is still 1.5 inches, this is still 1.5 inches. So I'm going to take these sides down, making more of an oval shape, reducing some weight in the blade. You can absolutely stop here if this feels good to you. I want as light a stick as I can make. So I'm taking, I don't know, 3/8 of an inch flat. And when I say flat, I am going to ease these corners. Just a little bit. I don't want any sharp edges anywhere on the sword. Not just for the preservation of my opponents, which I do care about, but because nature loves to break a hard edge. So if you have a hard edge, that's where it's going to break. Just feeling that edge. Taking off any, so right here, obviously you can't see it, but there's a really sharp line, and I just want to take that down. I'm just skimming. That's all it takes. Hitting that with sandpaper will do the same thing. Same thing on this side. Using my hands as much as my eyes here to really feel for any hard edges or spots that don't feel right. hard edge here. Just round that off. There we go. So at this point, I'm getting very close to that oval shape that I showed originally. That's kind of the finished axe handle, I guess, shape that I like in a sword. I've still got a good 1¼ inch flat rattan skin on front and back. My sides are almost down to 1¼ inch, and I have that oval profile I like. If I was going for a lighter stick, if I wanted something as super, super light, I could continue that bevel all the way down till they almost meet at the edge. That does take quite a bit of weight off of the blade. But I'm going to feel it. And I'm going to say, actually, no, this is starting to feel about right. You know, I know what I want my sword to feel like. And at this point, this doesn't feel too bad. It's probably a little heavy because remember, you're going to add tape and thrusting tip and everything else to it. But this is starting to feel pretty good to me. I might take a little bit off the back edge to help lighten it a bit. Yeah, that feels good. Yeah. You know, again, I don't know how much weight I'm just taking off by doing that. I know that I can feel it in my hand. And this is starting to feel like a pretty good stick. So yeah, I know that there's a lot of shaping in this that isn't necessary. Again, you can just have flat sides. You can just have a round stick of rattan. This shape works for me. Thick here, handle, tapered oval for the blade. Let's go on to the rest of it. All right, we are back at the bench. For me, the blade and the basket hilt assembly are two different things. And honestly, you could do them in either order. I do the basket hilt first because, as I said, if it still feels too heavy for me, I'm going to take weight off the tip. So we're going to do the entire basket assembly before we do anything with the blade. To round this over, grab a utility knife and then just knock off that hard corner. 45-degree angle, work your way around. It just takes a minute. While the rules don't require you to do this on the pommel side, they do require you to do this on the tip, whether you have a thrusting tip or not. And in addition, from not cutting your opponents open, and I have been cut by the hard end of a rattan sword more than once, this also helps preserve your tape and keeps your thrusting tip from getting knocked off. And I'll talk all about that when we get to the thrusting tip section of our little demo. It's important on the pommel side because the way that I tape these, if there's a hard edge there, the hard edge will cut the tape. So just take a minute to round that corner over. And we'll do the same thing up top, and I'll talk about that again in more detail when we finish the end of the weapon. See, weapon makes me sound like Arnold Schwarzenegger. The sword, the baton. Focus, there we go. Again, it doesn't take a lot. All right. As I mentioned earlier, I don't use any metal in the attachment of the basket hilt. I do use triggers, however. I'm very particular about what my triggers are made out of and where they're located on the handle. I think that a Latigo makes a really good trigger. It doesn't stretch, it's very durable, they don't break. I end up reusing these for years at a time, just going from sword to sword to sword once I have them cut out. Your thickness, you know, this is all going to be personal preference, but this works for me. This is, I don't know, 3/8 maybe. How thick is this? 1/2 inch. So this is about a 1/2 inch piece of Latigo. Maybe, I doubt it's 1/8 of an inch thick. Just over a 1/16 of an inch thick. 1/16 and a half. This is a good trigger for me. Take a marker and your trigger. The way that I like to do triggers is I'll grab the sword where I'm going to have the final grip, which for me is right in the center of my grip area. I'll thread the trigger through where I'm going to end up with it. Now, if you wear gloves when you're fighting like I do, and you haven't done this 200 times, it's a good idea to put your fighting glove on to make sure you have enough space in the trigger. I know exactly how much space I want in my trigger, so I'm going to not do that. But if you wear gloves and you haven't done this before, put your glove on. Fold the trigger over, like so. And then you adjust how much space you have by simply moving this in or out, right? You want it so that it's not this giant loop that doesn't do anything, right? That doesn't give you any retention. You don't want it so tight that you can't get your finger in and out of it, especially with a glove on. It will stretch slightly. Latigo doesn't stretch almost at all, but if you're using a veg tan leather, it will stretch quite a bit. And this is kind of a one and done thing, so try to get it right the first time. But you want a bit of resistance in and out without being too tight. I know exactly how tight I want mine to be. What I'm actually measuring right here is where the end of the trigger is going to be. So I hold it, I pull my hand out, that's where the trigger is going to end up. I take my marker and I make a mark right where the loop of the trigger starts to go upwards. And I'll show you why that's important. Then I come around to the side and I draw parallel lines along the trigger. Oh yeah, one more thing I wanted to mention on trigger layout. I know some folks like to have their trigger directly in line with the blade, like that, that's completely fine. For me, the way I hold my blade, that puts the trigger kind of outside my finger. I like to have my trigger as deep into the web of my hand as possible. So when I grip the sword, I take the trigger and I pull it so that it's all the way in to that first webbing of my finger. I like it to be all the way up in there. So when you have your trigger laid out like such, it gives you two important references. This is the tape line and this is the cutout line. The cutout line isn't always necessary. I've gotten in the habit of doing it because I've run into problems with it before. And that problem is, if you add that 1/4 inch of trigger leather to the full thickness of your 1.5 inch rattan, trying to get the basket onto your sword can be a huge pain in the ass. I've actually had to cut out a little bit of the basket hilt. You don't want to do that. So instead of doing that, I'm going to do this really ridiculous anal retentive thing, and I'm going to carve this out. This is one of those things that when you forget to do it and you go to put the basket hilt on and you cannot get the basket hilt over your trigger, it can be real frustrating. So I'm going to start there. I'm going to come down. And again, this is not difficult stuff. I'm just going to take a chisel. And what I want is, I want a shallow going to a fairly deep cut. Because rattan is so fibrous, it's really easy to carve. Do be careful not to continue this all the way down into your handle. If you need to, make a little stop cut up here. Go a little bit deeper. You want this groove deep enough so that both layers of your trigger will sit down inside of it nicely. And that is almost perfect, just a tiny bit more. So I'm just cutting a little groove, just enough so that the trigger will now sit flush with the rest of the weapon. So now that hole it has to fit through will go smoothly all the way around. So remember that secondary mark I made. What I want is a length about, I don't know, that long, 8 inches or so. Enough to easily go around the sword. Go ahead and cut a couple of these as you're positioning things. It's much easier to have them ready to go than trying to fiddle with holding 3 things at once. I'm going to take the end of the trigger. I'm going to lay it flat. Remember the mark I made back here where it curls up? I'm going to put one piece of strapping tape right at that mark. Wrap it around tight. That's going to be the primary thing holding it in this direction, but there's a bit more to it. So now, pause at this point, because if you're going to do a handle wrap like I do, you want to do the handle wrap now before you attach this, because trying to get the tape through this loop can be really difficult. So let me show you how I do it. I like a hockey tape for this. It's just the right amount of grip. It doesn't tend to get sticky. It's very strong. I like it for handles. So for me, I'm going to use hockey tape on this one. You'll see I use hockey tape a lot, actually. But starting at the pommel, you're going to wrap towards the blade. That is important on all your handle wrapping, because the primary direction of travel is away from your hand, right? So you want those overlaps of tape to overlap in a way that it doesn't roll that edge of the tape up when you pull it this direction. If you start this way and go down, each one of those wraps, you can roll that edge over, and then you start to get a sticky, messy handle. So remember, anytime you're wrapping a handle, go from the pommel towards the top in a spiral direction. I'm going to start with a full round at the base, and then I'm just going to do a tight spiral. I'm going to see if I can get the camera. Where's a squire when you need one? There, can you see that? I think so. I'm going to do a wrap, and I'm overlapping, I don't know. So I guess I'm overlapping about 1/4 inch. That seems about right. I'm just going to work my way up the handle. And I'll show you what I meant by those overlays in a second. This is a key part to the process, because to get this nice clean handle wrap where your trigger is integrated with the wrapping, you got to do it like this. You could wrap the handle and then do all your trigger work. But again, trying to get your wrapping inside that trigger can be really difficult. And if you want it to be seamless, like I do, then lay that over, and now come up over your trigger. And you want to get that line as close to the strapping tape as possible, so that you have that. Now continue this all the way up until you've reached the top of your handle. You have your handle sitting down in its groove, and I'm going to stop right there with a full wrap. So what I was talking about before, and hopefully you can see this, each layer is stacked so that when I run my hand this way, it's very smooth. When I run my hand this way, I start to lift up those uncovered edges. Since we use swords and they always want to be moving away from your hand, if you wrap it this direction, these edges don't tend to roll up and make your grip sticky. It's just something that I have learned over many, many years. So that works for the base wrap of the handle. Now, remember that other piece of strapping tape we had? Finalize your trigger position. Take your strapping tape. Give it a couple of layers. Now, if you're wondering, Syr Justus, there's no way that'll keep from pulling out. You are correct. If you put pressure on this now, it will pull out. But you can either take 2 wee little finishing nails, or I prefer a wee little screw, and I go down right in the middle of that strapping tape. Give yourself a pilot hole. Take your wee little screw and sink that screw through both layers of your trigger into the rattan. You want it flush. Now you've pinned both layers to the rattan and no amount of force is going to pull that out. That's how I do it. I do like to clean this up a bit. And that's the whole trigger assembly. Voila. If you want to do additional handle wrapping, you can. But as far as I'm concerned, this is good to go. Now we work with the basket. Again, grab a couple strips of strapping tape to have on hand. I just pull off, I don't know, a long foot. I put it on the edge of my bench and cut it. I try not to cut strapping tape or any other tape with scissors just because the adhesive builds up on the blade and you have to end up cleaning it off. It's not a huge deal. It's just a pain in the ass. WD-40 will take that adhesive off. But for me, it's easier to use a utility knife and just toss the blade. I want, I don't know, 4 to start with. I'll end up using more. I'm getting low on strapping tape. Take your basket. As you're trying to get the basket hilt to come up through the hole, if that trigger is too tall, it can be very difficult to get this to fit properly in the hole. Even with that cutout, it's pretty tight. I like to fit mine so that the end of the basket is just slightly below the pommel of the sword. So there's like, I don't know, 1/8 of an inch total with the bevel in the end. I make sure that the center line of my pommel is aligned with my edge marking. I take one of my strips of tape that I have handy already, and then with pretty firm downward pressure, I wrap it around. Don't worry about getting all your pressure on the first one because subsequent wrappings will make this tighter. Good. So now, watch how I do this if I can get it on camera. I want downward pressure onto the sword. So I'm going to press down and then wrap. Let it come around. And we'll do that again. Start your tape. Press down hard. Pull the tape down. Come around the back. Press down hard. You want really good contact here. You don't want this floating up and down. So whatever you have to do, if you have to put a clamp here, whatever, you want this piece to rest solidly on the pommel of the sword. I found that pressing down on it really helps get that locked in. And that's it. You know, that's what, 24 inches of strapping tape. You can go around a couple more times if you want. I've never had one of these come loose. You know, again, part of it is making sure that it is firmly attached so that it's not moving around. But yeah, strapping tape's strong stuff, man. Once you get a couple wraps around there, it's not going anywhere. Let's do a third one just for safety. Press down. Press down. Wrap tight. Solid. We're going to do the exact same thing on the top. I'm going to cut a couple more strips of tape. One thing that I forgot to mention, and I had a feeling I was going to do this. If you do want to tape the end of your rattan, you want to do that before you put your basket on. And about 50% of the time, I forget to do that. You can do it afterwards. It's just easier before. Because of this step down, if you want to have the leverage to push down on the basket to make it contact the blade, you need to put something on your bench that you can push against. So I'm going to use this alternate shaving horse, which I'll show you later. That allows me to push down to make sure that the tang contacts the rattan, because there is some play there and you want it to be hard. You want it to be tight up against the rattan so that the impact, anything hitting the basket, gets transferred to the blade and it's not moving that tape back and forth, sawing it off, if that makes sense. So we're going to do a first wrap just to hold everything in place. I'm going to press down, and I'm pressing down very hard. I'm putting all of me on that. Come up from the bottom, press down. Come up, press down. Press down. Oh, keep your tape from turning if you want to do a neat job. Press down. Speaking of turning your tape, I know guys that like to kind of spiral their tape and turn it into kind of a tape rope. If that works for them, awesome. I've never felt like I had to do that. Again, I've never had a basket come loose. Ever, 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 ever. Not one time. Solid. So there. Now, in case I haven't mentioned it several times already, I've left this long. I tend towards 36 to 37 finished length with a thrusting tip. So I leave them a bit long because for me, it's easier to balance the sword by taking material off the end than anywhere else on the weapon. If it feels heavy, I take a 1/2 inch off and I feel it again. If it still feels heavy, I take another 1/2 inch off. And this is super personal preference. I know guys that fight with 40-inch swords and they love that. I know guys that fight with really short swords. They're really, kind of thick swords. You have to decide what works for you. One of my deciding factors is when I do a low return, I don't want the sword to hit the ground. I want it to be able to come through even if my arm is very low. For me, if I do a low return, I want the sword to not hit the ground. So for me, 37 is the max on that. If I go any longer, I tend to start hitting the ground on a low return. And I do use that return quite a bit. So that's the only, real stopping point for me, is that I don't want to hit the ground with my sword when it's down like that. So this feels a little tip heavy, and it should, because it's quite a bit longer than it's supposed to be at this point. So I use an inch thick thrusting tip material. I like this semi-rigid kayak type foam for making thrusting tips, and I will show you how I do that. So I know that this sword is already going to take an inch off. So I'm going to take an inch of it off and see how it feels. Okay. So I took that initial inch off. It still felt a little tip heavy. I took another 3/4 of an inch off, and that feels pretty good. Maybe slightly heavy, but definitely it's not a club. It's not a beater. This feels pretty good. And I think without trying to make it significantly shorter or taking more off of the blade, I'm not going to get any lighter than that. Thrusting tips. I'll show you how I do it. Well, kind of. The easiest way to get these off is to cut them on the bandsaw, but I know that not everybody has a bandsaw, so I'll show you another easy way to do it. If you don't have a bandsaw, take your rattan, put it on your material, draw a circle around it, as I have here. Take a sharp chisel and press straight down. And do this all the way around. It does not have to be exact, and obviously your chisel's not going to be curved unless you happen to have a curved chisel. You want to just push straight down. I find this easier than trying to do this with a utility knife. And it's fine if it's a little fat. In fact, it's good if it's a little fat, because then you can compress it and make it a little bit taller. What you don't want is it to be too thin. So like with all cutting tools, make sure your finger is not in line with the blade. And clean this up just a little bit. There we go. So it's a little ragged, and obviously when I do this on the bandsaw, I get a nice perfect circle. But again, not everybody has a bandsaw. I do not recommend trying to do this with a jigsaw. I think the chisel method is very safe. You can do it with a utility knife. It's just difficult in this thick stock to try to work yourself around. It works fine. I've certainly done it with a utility knife, but the chisel is the easiest way, in my opinion. Since I just cut this edge, it is very sharp, right? You can cut yourself on this edge. You can cut your opponent with this edge. There's a reason that the Marshal's Handbook says that this has to be rounded. And it doesn't matter if you're using it without a thrusting tip or with a thrusting tip, it has to be rounded. So aside from taking care of your opponent, which you really should do, you also want to round this edge, because when you have a thrusting tip on it and you have it taped on, like we're going to do, that hard, sharp edge is why your thrusting tips come off. Because as you strike your opponent, that hard, sharp edge cuts the tape and away goes your thrusting tip. I swear that is why most people lose their tips. I don't know if I've lost a thrusting tip, maybe twice. Maybe twice. I honestly don't remember ever losing a thrusting tip. I'm sure it's happened. But my thrusting tips rarely, if ever, come off. And I think a lot of that is because I round this edge really nicely so that there is not a hard cutting surface that cuts the tape and sends this flying. There are a number of ways to round this edge. You can do it with sandpaper. I like to grab a utility knife and just at a 45-degree angle, just chamfer for that edge. You want to cut from the bottom up. You don't want to cut downwards, because remember, rattan is all fibers. So you want to cut upwards from the base to the top. Just work your way around. Make it a nice, soft 45. Not only does this protect your opponent, and I have been cut by sharp sword ends more than once, including a very memorable one in my nether regions. We won't talk about that any further. But it preserves your tips. So if you can't be altruistic, be selfish. Either way, round your tips. When you have a fairly nice bevel, and you can do all of this with the knife. I want to kind of show more than one way of doing it. Once you have that, grab some sandpaper or a sanding block and just roll it. You can do the whole thing with sandpaper. It just takes a lot longer. If you start with the utility knife, you spend a lot less time sanding. And I'm not sure that rattan dust is something you really want to be breathing a lot of. I'm pretty sure you're going to get silicosis like some coal miner. In fact, if you have respiratory sensitivities, you might want to wear a dust mask when you're working with rattan. Because again, I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of mineral silicas. Silica? There's a lot of silica in rattan. You don't want to breathe in the fine dust of that stuff. So that is a nice, friendly, round corner. And hopefully that's coming through on the video. Okay. Ideally, you have some way of holding your rattan vertically on your bench. But if you have a bench vise of any kind, it's nice to be able to work with both hands and have something else hold the rattan. If you don't have a bench, maybe you have a friend. You can also sit in a chair and use your lap, cross your legs and use your knees as a way to hold this. But this is ideal. Just as before, you want your strapping tape. I try to use as little tape as I can get away with, because what ends up happening is tape is dense, and you'd be surprised how much all the tape on your sword weighs. So you go through all the trouble of making a lightweight sword, and then you throw on 4 or 5 ounces of tape, and suddenly you have a log again. So I use the minimum amount of tape I need to get the job done. Putting double-sided tape here don't bother with it. I definitely know that some people recommend that. The foam itself is not strong enough. Even if you were to make this a perfect bond, if you stress this foam, the foam's just going to tear off and leave a little bit of fuzz here. So don't bother with double-sided tape. Put your thrusting tip on the tip of your weapon. Grab one of your pieces of tape, and without compressing the foam, you don't want to pull down hard and compress this. Just, medium firmness, kind of the weight of your hands. Tape it in place. We're going to go across. We're going to go across the other direction. And there's probably more tape than I need here. You can go a little bit. You want at least, I'd say, 1 inch to 1.5 inches of tape. So we've got across. Now we're going to go the other direction. Again, I'm not bearing down. I'm just hand pressure. And we're going to go the other way. So now we have a full cage surrounding the thrusting tip. Since the thrusting tip is a little bit wider than our sword, that's actually a good thing, because now I can take this tape, and here I do want a little bit of compression, but I only want enough compression to make the thrusting tip conform to the blade shape. Not a lot, just enough so that it's a smooth. I know this could start looking crazy real quick. I won't do a whole lot of, you get the idea. The joint that's important is where the rattan meets the foam. That's that part that when you strike and you hit somebody right there, it's trying to cut that tape, which is how you lose your thrusting tip. So I make sure that I have a couple layers of tape that span that joint. So that joint is right here. I'm going to put this tape right in the middle of that and reinforce that seam. because that's where your sword gets cut. And that's it. I know it doesn't look like much, but like I said, I almost never lose thrusting tips. I'm sure it's happened. But again, I did go a little crazy with the tape, so just a quick, and we can just peel off the excess. And as my ultralight backpacking friends will tell you, an ounce is an ounce. 16 of them make a pound. That is our thrusting tip. Now we're going to talk about the blade. And at this point of the video, you're thinking to yourself, but Justus, you spent over an hour making this sword. When I'm just making a stick, and I tend to make them in batches, it doesn't take me an hour. Talking through it, trying to make sure the camera is set up so that you can see what I'm doing, takes a lot longer. I've made enough of these that, I don't know, maybe a half hour. It probably takes me a half hour start to finish if I'm just working, listening to music, making a sword. Let's talk about blade covering options. The traditional is strapping tape. You take strapping tape, you wrap it around in a spiral, and then you put duct tape over it. The idea of the strapping tape is to hold those fibers together, because as we saw, when rattan breaks, it turns into a broom. So that strapping tape is wrapped around in a spiral to hold all that together. That's both good for the sword, and it keeps these from sticking in your opponent's eye. The thing is, so if I was, this stick is toast, but say I showed up to fight at a tournament, and my stick looked like this, right? Big chunk of rattan sticking out. It's on me to make sure that I tape that up so that I'm not sticking my opponent in the face with this rattan, right? That's sword maintenance. That's stuff you have to do yourself. I think strapping tape is fine if you're doing rattan swords with duct tape. I prefer hockey tape for the same purpose. I'll show you why. Strapping tape is very slick, right? It's strong in tension. It does a good job of holding those fibers together, but it's very slick. And on a traditional sword, and this is strapping tape with duct tape over it, the old style way. Duct tape doesn't stick very well to strapping tape, right? When you put strapping tape down and then you put duct tape over it, it's hard for the duct tape to stick to that strapping tape, and you get all those little nodules, coming off. Hockey tape has a cloth surface, and it's a grippy cloth surface. And I found that duct tape sticks really well to hockey tape. So consider, instead of wrapping your sword spiral with strapping tape, consider using hockey tape. It's also very strong in tension, but it has the advantage of having a surface that duct tape sticks to much better than strapping tape, in my opinion. As far as longevity, I've noticed zero difference in how long my swords last wrapped in strapping versus wrapped in cloth tape. There's an alternative. So here we have traditional, right? Duct tape over strapping tape. You can see we're pretty chewed up. This is a piece of heat shrink tubing over hockey tape. Now, this one is brand new. However, this one was fought with until it broke. Give you an idea of what it looks like. Again, it doesn't wear. Like occasionally you'll hit somebody that has a sharp piece of armor, or you hit a shield edge wrong, and you may gouge out a chunk of this, hard plastic. Not hard, it's a semi-hard plastic. But if that happens, you take some electrical tape and just tape it down. So occasionally what'll happen is you'll hit someone's hard shield edge or a piece of their armor that'll cut the tape or cut the tubing, and you'll get a, you know, a wound like this. But you just take a piece of electrical tape and tape it back down and you're good to go. This is pretty rare. So on this stick, which I used for months, that and maybe one other place got a big chunk taken out of it like that. The rest of it, no retaping, it's good to go. So this stuff, you buy it in 10 or 30 foot rolls. I buy the 1.5 inch. I wish they made an 1 3/8, but it goes from 1 1/4 inch, 1.5 2 inches, on and on. It's fairly thick stuff. It's very durable. And there is a heat sensitive adhesive inside here. So when you put it onto your stick and you heat it to shrink it down, it actually glues itself to whatever's underneath it. So whether that's the hockey tape or bare rattan, I think you can get away with bare rattan. I don't see how it would be different from Silaflex. Back when we did Silaflex swords, they were much more popular. I don't think you had to have an underwrap. I do the underwrap just kind of out of habit, and it only, you know, it might weigh an ounce if I actually weighed the tape. But you could probably get away just fine with just using this and no underwrap. But if you want to be belt and suspenders, either use strapping tape or hockey tape underneath of it. But it is really, really cool stuff. And I don't duct tape my swords anymore because, you know, again, once they start getting ragged like this, you can either put another layer of tape on, which is heavy. You can try to strip all this tape off, which if you've ever done that, it's not a good day. Or you just keep on patching it on the spaces that are coming off, and you end up, you know, with a crappy heavy sword. These swords were made at the same time. You know, you can see the surface difference. This was my primary stick. This was my backup. And you see how torn up the duct tape one is, and you see how not torn up the heat shrink tubing one is. So you do you, your choice. I'll show both methods. I'm going to do the heat shrink on this sword, but I'll also show you how I do a traditional wrapped and duct tape sword as well. Whether you're doing heat shrink tubing or you're doing duct tape, is get your underlayment, whether that's strapping tape or hockey tape, which I prefer, and do a spiral. I don't overlap. I try to get it side by side. I don't see any advantage in an overlap, and I'm trying to have as little material in the blade of the weapon as possible. So I'm going to start down at the base, and I'm going to start wrapping upwards. And again, I want to lay it down side by side. I don't overlap when I'm doing the blade wrap, whether it's strapping tape or hockey tape. Be careful on how you wrap this. These days, I wrap away from myself. Once upon a time, I would wrap towards myself, pulling upwards. And I was wrapping, I tend to put a lot of tension on this. And the hardest I've ever been punched in the face was when I was pulling up hard on a piece of strapping tape and it snapped and I hit myself right in the nose. And that was not a good day. Yeah, if you punch yourself and it hurts, are you weak or strong? Anyway, these days I push away from myself. That was a lesson I only needed to be taught one time. So yeah, I'm putting as much tension on this as I think the tape will bear. If you pull too hard, you'll tear the tape. Not a big deal, just, you know, start over in that area. But I do want to get a firm wrap because I'm trying to hold those fibers together. Another reason I like the heat shrink tubing is that stuff really shrinks down. And if it starts to get spongy, you can heat that area up and it'll shrink down again. It's cool stuff. But I try to put as much tension as I can without breaking the wrapping material. And I've got a pretty good feel for what this breaks at and what strapping tape breaks at. It's strong stuff, but you can tear it. You can shear tear it. This is not the most fun part of the job. And I will probably insert a little sped up section here. So, remember that whatever you use as a base layer, whether it's strapping tape or cloth tape or duct tape or whatever, it's still your responsibility when you show up to fight your opponents to make sure that you cover up. If there's rattan sticking out of your sword, it's on you to cover that up so that you're not in danger of one of those long rattan splinters going into somebody's eye. You don't want that. Not cool, and the rules require that you tape your sword up. I'm not a huge rule follower, so if there's a rule that I believe in, it's probably a pretty good rule. I meant I always follow every rule. I never break any of our rules. As I mentioned, if this tape were to break, my hand would go down, not into my visage. You're about 2/3 done. This is my primary strike zone. In fact, right here is my primary strike zone. And when I break a stick, I break it right here. This is the area that I'm most concerned about getting tight, consistent wrapping. Sometimes I'll do a double layer. I'm not going to with this one, not with the heat shrink. You do want to be careful when you get up to the thrusting tip. If you put tension on the thrusting tip, even if it doesn't compress right now, it'll kind of gradually compress. So don't put a whole lot of tension up on the thrusting tip. In fact, I just go to that same line I was talking about and I leave the top of the thrusting tip untouched. All right, so now we're getting close to the top. And again, I'm just reinforcing that border. Right there is where the rattan meets the foam, and that's what wants to cut and come off. Okay, whether you're going to do duct tape or you're going to do shrink wrap or whatever, shrink wrap, heat shrink tubing, you want to do your thrusting tip taping now. I know that not every place is a red thrusting tip requirement, but my colors are red and black, so I just do red anyway. Some places the thrusting tip has to be red regardless of whatever the rest of the sword is or the weapon is. I just like a red thrusting tip. I believe contrasting color is what the rules say. For me, that contrasting color just happens to be red. So I'm cutting a cloth tape, like an athletic tape. I think that it has a little bit more grab. It doesn't slide off of your opponent quite as easily as a electrical tape does. So I think it makes a very good thrusting tip tape. And I just use a good quality athletic tape. And I generally do one across, and then I go back over blade to blade, because that's the primary, that's where you're getting the most torque put on the thrusting tip. This is also why I don't need to go crazy with the strapping tape, because I know that it's going to get the edge tape and it's going to get everything else. There's a lot of layers of tape crisscrossing over that seam that wants to break. So I just pull that down taut. And there's my thrusting tip. Plenty of give. There's nothing compressing at this direction. There's a little bit of compression this way. And, again, I just don't lose thrusting tips. Up to this point, everything is the same, whether you're going to do duct tape or heat shrink tubing or whatever you finish your swords with. Leather. I've actually seen a leather wrap sword and it was pretty cool. That's a lot of work for me, for something that's not going to last 6 months, so not so much. But everything up to this point is the same. If you're going to do duct tape, it couldn't be simpler, right? You grab your favorite duct tape. Do go for a duct tape that is thick and has a good sticky backing. There are some really cheap duct tapes. They tend to come on those giant rolls. They're very thin and they don't have a very strong adhesive. So back when I did used to use duct tape, I was really fond of this stuff, this extra wide Gorilla Tape, for a couple reasons. One, it's incredibly sticky. It is super sticky. It's also very thick. And the combination of being thick and sticky makes it really good for our swords. Also, with this wide tape, instead of, it usually takes me three wide strips of regular 1.5 inches, or what is this? 1 7/8 inches. This usually takes 3 strips this way, this direction, to go all the way around. This only takes 2. So I think there's less tape on the stick. So if you're going to use duct tape, you know, you just peel off your sword length strip and put it on. Not doing duct tape on this one. We're doing heat shrink. So I buy this stuff in the 30-foot roll. I will put a link to the stuff that I use. I don't make any money off that, so don't think it's that kind of thing. I'm sure you can find better prices. I would recommend making sure you get at least 1.5 inches. If you can find 1 3/8 inches, let me know. And look for the stuff that specifically says adhesive lined, because that adhesive lined really helps this stuff stick to the rattan or whatever is on top of the rattan. So adhesive lined is key. The thickness of the wall, as it shrinks down, it gets a little bit thicker. So it may seem really thin, it's not, but it gets thicker as it shrinks down, and I'll show you that. So we're just going to cut off a length, and I want to go from, obviously, the basket hilt. I don't cover the thrusting tip. I come up to the base of the thrusting tip. But you don't want this up on the thrusting tip, because obviously it's going to shrink down and compress your thrusting tip. But you also don't want this edge of plastic digging into your opponent. So I want this stopping there, you know, with the full thrusting tip above it. Maybe, you know, like a fraction of an inch up onto the thrusting tip. And then I will put a wrap of electrical tape up here to secure that end. So we're going from there to the basket hilt. I get a lot of swords out of a 30-foot roll. Somebody can do the math. But that's my piece. Okay, so this part couldn't be simpler. You open up your heat shrink and you slide it down over the top. Watch me have a hard time getting this heat shrink on. Just wants to make a fool out of me. Once you get it over the thrusting tip, it goes down pretty easy. There we go. Remember I said I made that thrusting tip a little bit wide? There we go. All right. Bring it down so that the seam is aligned with the blade, because that's going to end up being the thickest part. Perfect. So I've got about 1/8 of an inch on the foam of the thrusting tip down to the base. There's a little bit of probably talcum powder or some kind of fine powder on the inside to allow you to slide it. That just wipes right off. Don't worry about that. I'll probably have to do voiceover because I think my mic is going to pick this up. But again, it's kind of obvious what I'm doing. Turn your heat gun on. I think you can do this with a hair dryer too. It doesn't take a lot. And then I try to keep the heat coming from all sides. So I watch it shrink down, and then I move on. I start at the base and move upwards because, you know, heat rising and stuff. I am going to bring the camera closer so you can see how it shrinks down. I just try to keep the heat as even as I can. And just be patient with it. If there's spots that seem like they're not as tight as the rest of the wrap, hit it with more heat. This stuff shrinks down so hard, you will see the tape lines underneath of it. And that's kind of what I use as a guide. Even though I didn't overlap the hockey tape, I can still see the lines between the layers of hockey tape. And that's how I kind of know that I've got enough heat on that section. I'm keeping the tip of the gun about, 4 inches away. I don't want the gun right up on the heat shrink. Before it shrinks down, it's just smooth black plastic. As it gets shrunk down onto the rattan, you start seeing the features of the rattan underneath the plastic. And that's what tells me that it's got enough heat on it. As you start to get towards the tip, up by the thrusting tip, obviously you want to be really careful up there not to overheat that area. You want it just enough so that it shrinks down to the diameter of the base of the thrusting tip. If you're using an actual heat gun, one of these, be very careful of that tip. It gets incredibly hot and you don't want to get your finger on that. Also, don't set it down on anything flammable. This one has these rubber bumpers that when you set it flat, it keeps the tip well off the surface. Still be careful with it. Don't set it down on papers or anything flammable. And now we're down to finishing touches. We're going to put the edges on. We're going to cover up our strapping tape and make the bottom and top look nice. And that's it. Like the rules say, a contrasting color. So if you're using silver duct tape, you can use black or purple or anything that'll contrast against the silver. Since this is black and my colors are red and black and all my swords are red and black, I just use red electrical tape. White looks nice too. You should be able to see very clearly, this is your center line going up, and you just want to lay it on as straight as possible, just for pretty. Side note, make sure this is cool before you do this. If you're a new fighter and you bring your rattan stick to marshal it and they tell you to go sharpen your sword, which is kind of an old joke, they mean retape your edges because they can't see your edges. So I have the edge taped front and back. I take some black electrical tape. And again, this stuff can kind of shrink. If you put a lot of tension on it, as you stretch it, it'll want to contract. And if you put too much pressure up on the thrusting tip, it'll squeeze your tip over time. So we're just going to do it doesn't have to be tight. We're just cleaning up this edge to make it look nice. And to make sure that that plastic edge of the heat shrink tubing isn't sticking out to cut anybody. This blade is covered in adhesive now, so it doesn't cut very well. Down here at the basket hilt, I really just kind of slather this stuff on until I cover up all the strapping tape, just because strapping tape's ugly, right? I have found that if you use a utility knife to cut your electrical tape and you get that nice clean edge, it's much less likely to roll than if you just tear it and you get that kind of ragged edge. Little tips. Ideally, you want to tape this end before you put it all together, but you can do it now. Now that they're allowing thrusting tips on the hilt, I make sure that I use, a same color tape. I don't want anybody thinking I've got a thrusting tip down here because I don't use the hilt thrust thing. So yeah, make sure that it's not a contrasting color. Otherwise, you are telling people that there's a thrust there where there's not. We're doing the same crisscross of cloth tape. And again, we're just covering up the rattan. We want it to look nice. This is definitely a skippable step. if you don't want to bother with it. But as I was extolling the virtues of the heat shrink tubing sword, I will not retape this weapon. Like, at no point in time will I have to come back and touch the tape up. Like I said, maybe I might have to put a little bit of electrical tape on a big tear. But other than that, this sword is done. Done. And that is how I make an SCA fighting sword. I hope this was helpful to you guys. Feel free to hop into the comments and tell me all the things I'm doing wrong, including why I'm spending way too much time making something that's only going to last for a few months. This is the first in what I hope to be a series of videos about the SCA and just day-to-day stuff, how to make gear, how to work with stuff. I do actually want your comments in the feedback. Let me know if I didn't make something clear, or if there's questions you have, just drop it down below. Right, so stay tuned. I'm going to add a couple work holding and working with rattan if you do not have a shaving horse, etc. I'll add that on after this. Take care, guys. So, you might be saying, but Justus, I don't have a shaving horse. How do I work with rattan? Well, this is a very easy thing to make. This is 2 pieces of 2x4 with a hole drilled in them, a wing nut on the bottom with a bolt, and I'm using a cam clamp at the top, but you do not need a cam clamp. You could just as easily close this with a, or a C-clamp or any kind of clamp. You need some kind of clamp, but it doesn't have to be one of these fancy cam clamps. This is just really quick and easy. But if you do not have a shaving horse, you can build one of these, and I'll show you how they work. You put this in a bench vise. You put the rattan into the hole, and you have to adjust the bottom to match your rattan, but once you have that set, you don't have to adjust the bottom anymore. And then you just use the cam clamp on top, and it's not going anywhere. Again, you could also use a clamp like this. If you don't have a cam clamp, same thing. You can clamp it with this. You could clamp it with a big C-clamp. You could clamp it with anything. But this gives you the ability to work away from the bench, because it can be really difficult to have it clamped this direction in your bench. It's very awkward to get to it. It'll work, I've done it, but it's easier if it's not being clamped in line with the bench. Now, you don't have one of these. You don't have a bench. You don't need one. If you have a draw knife and you have a piece of rattan, you can use your chest. In fact, there's a long tradition of people using spoke shaves. They have this kind of special leather collar they wear to put against their chest. But you don't need anything fancy. Grab some cloth, grab a t-shirt, put that there, lean into the rattan, and you can do all of the same things that I was showing you before. You might have to get down on the ground to do it, but you can lean into the work and use the draw knife this way with a breastplate. We have armor. I would just sit down with a breastplate and a piece of rattan. And again, it doesn't have to be fancy. Just something to keep this from digging into your sternum too much. And since you're pulling this way with the rattan, you can hold it just like this. Use your feet if you need to. But here, let's take a... You can do the same things I was doing before, just pulling off your chest. So I'm holding it with my feet and I'm pulling this way. It's pretty easy. Not ideal, but it works. Also, A lot of people don't have bench clamps, but they do have machinist clamps, especially ones that have pipe fittings in them. These work great for rattan, but be very careful not to crush your rattan with these jaws. Either using the metal side, which you can do just fine, or the pipe fitting side, which works better. I would definitely use a piece of leather, and I keep one of these at my clamp just for this reason. I would put this around the rattan to give yourself enough grip and a bit of cushion so that those jaws aren't crushing your rattan. And when you are tightening it down to hold it, to work on it, use the minimum amount of pressure necessary to hold the work without crushing the rattan, because it absolutely will. The last thing you want to do is put a little too much pressure on here and crush the piece of rattan that you're trying to turn into a sword. Because the way these jaws work, man, you can really damage a sword. So just the bare amount of pressure necessary to hold it and keep it from moving around without cranking down on this handle, because you'll crush that fiber.